Now, before I begin, the title is a bit misleading, in that it's entirely too obvious to be what the video is actually about. Anyone with even a passing idea of what games are know that most games are about information. From hero shooters to spectacle fighters to poker to, yes, even tactics games, success is largely dependent on information the player can gather and interpret to optimize their gameplay until they achieve success. So, what is this video actually about? It's about why I love certain tactics games and dislike others, and we will be using the two IPs in the title to highlight the difference, though I'll take some examples from other series and use them as B-roll footage as well. I don't think it's controversial to say that Fire Emblem is the premier TRPG series. You have a group of characters, or units, who go from battle to battle on grid-based maps, and every one of them has different roles, weapons, and stat spreads that you have to utilize to achieve the victory condition of that map. It's classic stuff, and works well to this day. Fire Emblem Engage was a fantastic game, and is just as strong gameplay-wise as any of the greats from Fire Emblem's past. My love of the franchise extends back to the release of Fire Emblem Awakening in 2013, and I've since gone back and fell in love with the GBA titles as well, as you can tell from the draft race of FE8 that I'm uploading as I edit the chapters. Alright, don't kill Natasha. Oh! Fuck. Gonna be a reset for me, dog. The series has gone through a lot of changes that are usually one and done ideas, but the core concept remains the same. A big emphasis in the series, especially from the GBA era onwards, is that every unit in your army is a fully fleshed out character with an identity, goals, and personality. The permadeath mechanic that's core to the series is then weaponized against the player by making them become extremely attached to these units, which makes them want to keep those units alive, forcing them into more clever or cautious play or risk losing said unit. This is a bit different from many other TRPGs like Triangle Strategy or Tactics Ogre. In the former, fallen units don't die, but instead retreat from the battle and are back for the next one, and in the latter, your army is made up of generic units who you recruit with in-game currency. Now, I want to point out that none of these approaches is superior to one another, and Fire Emblem isn't inherently harder than something like Triangle Strategy because of it. It just means you have different considerations when actually playing. Anyway, this attachment to the units in your army is the first layer of information, divorced from the gameplay but feeding into a player's desire to understand and get good at the gameplay. I won't go into any specific unit here, as there are plenty of other videos that go into them in various games, but this is part of the reason why I love things like Fire Emblem, Triangle Strategy, and Unicorn Overlord. They put in the effort to incentivize investing emotionally into the units you control. The next layer of information is a big one, which is the moment-to-moment gameplay, specifically looking at the battlefield. Going back to Fire Emblem, a big part of why I enjoy it so much is the ease of access. There is very little that you need to know to understand Fire Emblem gameplay, and yet the specific maps you're on facilitate fun strategies and optimization galore. It's not the deepest system on its own, but how it's used in many of the better games is what makes it so special to me. Just looking at the map here, we see that our goal is to survive for 10 turns, which tells us that enemies are going to be rushing our position. The cowardly player might take this to mean that they need to turtle at the start of the map. There's this space here where two members of your army can block enemy units after all. However, there are secondary objectives to be had deeper into the map that you need to be proactive in getting, not only because of the time limit, but also because of these pirate enemies that are moving on the water here. They're programmed to go and destroy villages if no player unit is in range, and if they succeed, then that village, which gives a useful item, is permanently locked away from the player. In addition, this map has a recruitable enemy unit that must be spoken to by a specific member of my army, this Pegasus girl here. So I need to use her in such a way as to get to that unit without them killing each other on his turn. Finally, more generic to most Fire Emblem maps, terrain is very important, providing both evasion and defense depending on what tile your unit is on. I mean, that evasion didn't matter for my cavalier here, but still. This terrain actually responds differently depending on what unit goes over it. Infantry units, those walking on their own 2 feet, take extra movement to pass through forest tiles, but it takes even more for units like my cavaliers. Desert tiles, not shown, take increasingly more movement for infantry than armored knights and then mounted units, except mages that don't suffer a movement penalty at all. Flying units can also, fly over all this stuff, but the cost is that they don't get the bonuses from the terrain tile if they act on one. All of this information is readily available just by looking at the map, and perhaps observing the movements of the enemies on the first turn in the case of those pirates. Notice how everything is nicely laid out from a top-down perspective, with some flourishes to simulate different structures like stairs or bridges. Getting into the information regarding the units themselves, which would be in layer 3, I can scroll over any of these enemy units and see exactly what their stats and equipment are, and if this were a modern Fire Emblem game, I could also see what abilities they had access to, as well as what those abilities do, since the names are usually plays on words or obtuse. Back on the map, I can hit the A button on any enemy to see what their movement range is, the blue, and what their attack range is, the blue and the red, and use that to effectively position my army. Take this first turn, where I position my knight, who has very high defense but low movement, just inside the range of this soldier enemy to draw him and his buddy in, so that on the next turn, the rest of my army can go to town. Look, I know this may seem basic, but it's these little things, namely the ease of access to information, that makes Fire Emblem one of the most accessible tactics games for me personally. All of the stats and values make logical sense and are easily calculated in my head since it's all additive. I don't need a complicated damage formula. It's my strength/magic plus my equipped weapon's might minus enemy defense/resistance. If my speed is higher than theirs, I attack twice. Done and done. All of the sprites, and in later games the models, are easily distinguished from each other, with different poses to indicate what class they are, and usually what weapon they're holding. In earlier titles, the games use different colors to differentiate your army from the enemies, whereas the 3D games have specific sprites for your units that show, their head and stuff. Regardless, more than the ease of access, I enjoy Fire Emblem because it takes these simple things and runs with them in ways that tickle my fancy. Great characters, strong incentives to play well based on good map design, diverse units with different strengths and weaknesses that yes, aren't all balanced, but are all fun to use, excellent UI providing easy access to critical info, and easy to understand mechanics, all combine to create an extremely satisfying experience most of the time, except for Revelation. We don't talk about Revelation. One or more of these aspects is always present in tactic systems I enjoy, from the diverse cast and excellent story of Triangle Strategy, to the simple to learn, hard to master mechanics of War Tales, to the way that terrain and stage hazards interact with strategy in Unicorn Overlord, to even the easy to understand gameplay of Civilization Warfare. I don't love all these games, particularly War Tales, but the battle systems themselves I can get behind 100%. But then we come to the other side of the coin, the tactics games I don't like. I want to be clear in saying that I am the problem here. You can go ahead and slap on a "for me" at the end of this YouTube title, because in no way am I saying that a lack of easy information makes a tactics game bad. It just makes it not for me. The main example I'll be using here is Final Fantasy Tactics, which I will say right off the bat I'm going to give another shot, particularly with the remake being out, and actually inspiring this video in the first place, because a lot of my issues with the game's presentation and UI were fixed, though I'll have to see for myself, if I like the game beyond that. For now, the original, or in this case, the War of the Lions remaster for the PSP. Final Fantasy Tactics is played from an isometric perspective, which is already a slight turnoff for me. It's definitely not a deal breaker, or Triangle Strategy wouldn't be one of my favorite tactics games, but it's definitely not my preference. I'm someone who very much doesn't like being obstructed when I'm trying to strategize. It's part of the reason I dislike Fog of War maps and Fire Emblem so much. That said, the isometric perspective does offer some advantages over a top-down one, namely how it can use elevation, which is usually a big part of these types of systems. This is something I very much enjoy working around, especially when there are fun strategies involving it, such as with Ien's ladders in Triangle Strategy, or even extending bow ranges in Final Fantasy Tactics. That said, almost none of what I praised Fire Emblem for is present in FFT. The story revolves around Ramza, and every other member of your army is a generic unit you recruit and who are randomly generated, stats and all, save for a few other story-relevant characters later on. Every unit can become any class, so there's no true differentiation aside from the bravery and faith stats that come packed to a unit to see whether they're good at physical or magical classes. Keep in mind, this doesn't lock you out of the other class, and it actually isn't even explained in-game what bravery and faith do unless you go to an optional tooltip in the menu. Once you get into the battle itself, the UI and game feel is just all off for me. Isometric is fine, but the game was designed so that you can only look at the battlefield from any of the four corners. You can zoom out a little bit and you can kind of angle it up just a tiny bit, but this is what you're stuck with, man. What ends up happening is that as enemy turns cycle, the camera spins all around to work around the obtrusive terrain to actually let you see what's happening, and it's very disorienting if you're not used to looking at games like this. This unfortunately wasn't something that was fixed in the remake, but I will praise it for adding a view where you can look at the battlefield from a pseudo top-down perspective, similar to Tactics Ogre Reborn, which looks great. The sprites at work here also aren't particularly distinct, with both sides of the army sharing the same class pool, which is totally fine, but there is no easy identifier like in Fire Emblem to differentiate your generic squire from an enemy generic squire. Yes, with a bit of adjustment, you can definitely tell the difference. I'm not going to pretend that it's not there, but what I'm saying is that it's too subtle when combined with the terrain and the graphics. It takes me a second to figure it out, which slows everything down and contributes to the other issues I have with the game. Now, let's look at the units themselves. I'm not going to comment on game balance or the story or anything really substantive because I'd be talking out my ass. I am not an expert on this game because I don't like it that much and thus haven't played it that much. What I want to focus on is strictly about game feel, the UI, and how convenient it is to gain information which is critical to understanding how the game works. So, notice how there are 3 bars attached to every unit. HP and MP are self-explanatory, but what is CT? Well, Final Fantasy Tactics uses an ATB system similar to mainline Final Fantasy games around that time, where units gain a certain amount of CT over a certain amount of time, and when they fill up their bar, they can act. A big part of tactics games is focused, planned assaults. To take down a tough enemy unit, it's often for the best to gang up on them when the situation allows. This is a fundamental strategy of games like Fire Emblem and Advance Wars, not pictured, because of the nature of your whole army taking their turns at once, and then the enemy army taking their turns and then back to you, and so on. In isometric tactics games like Final Fantasy Tactics, Tactics Ogre, and Triangle Strategy, your units and the enemy units have their turns all jumbled together based on, like a speed stat or the CT bar, or, whatever method they use. This makes effective strategizing harder, not worse, but definitely more complicated. This complexity is why it's incredibly crucial to have a clear turn order to reference, which more modern games in this style have, as you can see from the footage. How do you get this information in Final Fantasy Tactics? You have to hit the triangle button and go to a separate menu. Also, good luck if you don't have every name in your army of generics memorized. What a shit show. This is less than fucking worthless. Yes, the information is technically there and available to you, similarly to the bravery and faith that I mentioned earlier, where you can, look at a tooltip, but it's presented in such a hidden and obtuse way that I can't call it good. The units themselves take from traditional Final Fantasy games, where you can equip a multitude of weapons and armor depending on their class. It's very Final Fantasy V, which isn't a bad thing on its own, but that game also isn't as punishing as Final Fantasy Tactics is in the early game, which I've heard is when the game is at its most challenging. While you can't exactly micromanage equipment yet, because you don't have equipment, you do have to micromanage abilities, especially when you go to a new class. Units gain job points, or JP, for every action they take in that job. Sorry, I called it a class earlier. It's a job. And you can use all that JP to obtain abilities. How do you access this menu? On the map, press the triangle button, Party Roster. When you hover over the unit you want to work with, you don't hit the X button. No, that takes you to an equipment screen. Another triangle press, then abilities, then learn. Why the hell is the most fundamental progression system hidden away like this? Why isn't anything in this fucking game convenient to access? Sorry, I'm being too negative. I could go on though, such as commenting how a PS1 port is somehow lagging with every action more complicated than a standard sword swing, making the game feel even worse, but I won't. This is just an overview of things that turn me off of an otherwise good tactics game. All of the systems in Final Fantasy Tactics are very fun to play around with, and I'm really looking forward to sinking my teeth into it in the remake because wow, so many of my issues were fixed. They definitely seem to be taking cues from the UI of Triangle Strategy with the style of HP indicators above the units, though the vertical orientation of the turn order reminds me more of Final Fantasy X, but whatever. Depending on if I have enough thoughts on the subject, I might also make a follow-up to this video, sort of, and compare Final Fantasy Tactics to Triangle Strategy more directly, because I saw some dumb reviews on Steam and they annoyed me. Before I can do that though, I have to actually play Final Fantasy Tactics, so let's start with working on that site. And also, what about all of your other projects you're ignoring, you idiots? In conclusion, tactics games are all about information, and how easily one can obtain that information in-game is a huge factor in why I enjoy some games over others. This general preference of mine does extend to other genres as well. It's a big part of why I didn't enjoy Elden Ring after all, but I wanted to focus on just one genre for this video. In any case, thank you all for watching. Like, comment, and subscribe. Until the end, my friends.